Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Jana Finch, your host, and I'm the VP of Marketing at Cloud Institute. For those of you unfamiliar with Cloud Institute, we're an IT training company. We deliver cloud certification training with real-world practice. Our training, it includes comprehensive instruction taught by experts like Zaki Medina, our presenter today, who are practitioners in their fields. Training is delivered virtually, either as self-paced courses that you can complete on your own or in live instructor-led sessions. And then we combine that classroom training with virtual hands-on labs, which is a great way to practice your skills and validate what you've learned. Coming soon, we'll also be providing coaching as a service to individuals and teams. We not only want to train you on the skills that make your deployment, your cloud deployments more successful, but we also want to walk with you as a partner to make sure that the skills you learn in the classroom get transferred to the workplace, which is really at the end of the day what matters most. So today we're presenting Getting Started with AWS in 2022 with Zaki Medina. Zaki is an AWS expert, a multi-cloud solution architect, a data and security expert. He's also an entrepreneur and has been teaching IT since he was a teenager. I personally learn something new from him every time we speak. So a couple bits of housekeeping and then we'll get started. Thank you to those who responded before the webinar, letting us know what you wanted to learn today. I did pass that information on to Zaki and he's going to address what he can in today's presentation. If you do have any questions, just type them into the chat box. I'll bring them up during the presentation and we'll also have time for questions at the end. And yes, just to preempt, this will be available on replay. You'll receive an email with this webinar after it ends. Now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Zaki.
Thank you so much, Jana, and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time zone you're coming in from. Today we have a jam-packed session, and our session is really around, I know this is 2022, and why are we still talking about cloud? Because cloud sometimes can be cloudy. Let's just be real about that. And I want you to come from this course that this is basically, if you've heard about cloud, but you don't know where to start, and you have some questions about it, AWS in particular, and this is the place to get started. So we assume it's a ground up kind of webinar to get your feet wet, so to speak, right? So in our session today, we're going to cover what is cloud, and specifically we'll talk a bit about the basics of what the cloud story is, and AWS Cloud, how does AWS Cloud fit into that story, as well as its comparison with other cloud vendors in the environment, and why AWS, right? Why would we choose AWS? And what's the benefit around that, the value prop around that? And if we go to AWS, what are some of the design principles and security principles we would look to as we look to migrate from any of our on-premise IT workloads over to the cloud, right? And part of that, we will also go through sort of, the building blocks of what goes into a cloud environment. We'll take a peek under the hood for AWS, what they have under the hood in terms of cloud, in terms of compute, storage, database. Again, this is just an overview today. We will definitely run out of time if we jump into any one. And I know there are some questions that you guys have posted earlier about this, but don't, one thing I can definitely assure you is we will definitely have future webinar events that will focus in on those specific topics as well. We'll also do a bit of a demo around AWS account and how to get that set up, right? Especially if it's your first time. So the goal here is that coming out of this session, you'll know enough about AWS and cloud and even understand where to begin your journey in that story and so on. So hopefully this is sort of the agenda for today. So a quick question that comes about, whenever I start teaching any cloud course, I always ask my students, what is the cloud, right? Now, when you ask this question, what is the cloud, and there's a group of technical people, you can be assured there's going to be several different types of opinions, right? You'll get different answers, and everybody, has an answer, and it's based on their individual frame of reference, right? And so from their perspective, some of the few as people put in the words. So what I would encourage everyone to do is paste in the chat what you think is the cloud, right? And ultimately what cloud is, it's really someone else's computer, right? If you're really being honest about it, yeah, It's not my on-premise environment where it's my computer, my server sitting on my data center. It's somewhere else. And where somewhere else? And we sometimes say it's in the cloud, but it's nearby, maybe in the same continent, right? Or possibly in another continent. And so these are some of the examples when we talk about, and why is that very important, right? When we say it's someone else's computer, because anyone in IT, it automatically starts triggering questions around security, right? Think common questions could be, hey, if my workload and intellectual property is in the cloud, how do I secure it, right? That's a very good question. In fact, security is probably the number one thing of going to the cloud. And it kind of seems like anti, it doesn't make sense that, hey, if it was on premise, then why would I need to go think about security? It's on premise. I can control the security. Why would security be better in the cloud? Well, the answer is because with any cloud vendor such as AWS, they have to conform to the highest standard of security, probably even more than your typical on-premise organization would go through. So that security footprint posture would be anything above and beyond a typical enterprise could do or even afford. So yes, going to the cloud is secure. Now, there are instances where there are security breaches, and that's just common with everything. And part of that is around identity management servers, right? Don't have passwords with the name password or your first name, right? That's just step one of that journey. So let's look at this. When we talk about AWS, what is it? What is AWS? So this is just going into Amazon, their official definition, right? And AWS sort of stands for Amazon Web Services, and it started off as Amazon trying to do their own IT for themselves and saying, hey, we can also sell this to other people that need similar services, and why not, right? And so it has grown exponentially and is one of the most profitable business units within Amazon in their ecosystem. So AWS, if I were to read this out, right, it's the world's most comprehensive, broadly adopted cloud platform, offers over 200 fully featured services from data centers globally. Millions of customers, including the fastest growing startups, largest enterprises, and leading government agencies, are using AWS to lower costs, become more agile, and innovate faster. Now, it seems like typical marketing spiel, but there's a lot of buzzwords when we read this, right? But if we were to break this down further, right, and look at it, the first topic is cloud platform, right? What do I mean by cloud platform, right? And this is basically the conversation that comes up is, hey, there is on-demand and elastic IT infrastructure. I'm sure some of you have heard about on-demand, right? And this is really what it comes down to. In the previous, I guess, regime of on-premise, right? The previous paradigm of on-premise environment, we could not do on-demand, right? There would be a ton of capacity planning that would be needed, right? There would even be departments, people spending 3 to 6 months doing capacity planning for next year and the year after on their IT environment. And always you'd end up procuring more than what you need because you don't want to run out of it. You don't want to get into the dreaded 8-week window of getting servers in and getting logistics and supply chain, all of that figured out, especially now in the situation that we've been in, right? Like just think about how supply chain has been disrupted post-pandemic, how the world is going through that. So, on demand is a very powerful story. And in fact, I would challenge you to think about on demand as really a change in mindset, right? It's not just, hey, it's on demand infrastructure, but it's actually a change in mindset. And what that will do is it will also change how we go about deploying IT services and workloads and things of that nature, because it changes everything. It changes what we can do with our technology platform. It takes us away from this typical capital intensive model, where we procure things ahead of time, to something which is more easily, pay as you go model, right? More consumable approach, right? So this is a big positive for us. Next up is, over 200 fully featured services. Now, this is a huge positive. There's almost 200 plus services in AWS, which translates to, hey, there's a service for almost everything. This is a huge positive. And if you really want something, we really want to do something with technology, guess what? AWS can provide us the answer instead of us resorting to a manual approach. Now, obviously, for some of you, and me included, these 200 fully featured services are sometimes super overwhelming, right? And despite being a great fan of AWS, I personally don't feel they address new customers or beginners to their ecosystem, to their cloud environment very well, right? And in terms of guiding them and the services. And in fact, this is one of the reasons we started Cloud Institute, is to provide that sort of, that sort of nice, we'll hold your hand as we progress through this journey, right? From start to finish, wherever you are in that story, right? So this is something we're going to be looking at. And so definitely, I encourage you all to subscribe to our newsletters and to look up our blog posts and things of that nature and our upcoming webinars. So we'll definitely be covering some of these, eventually moving into more advanced topics down the road. Um, Next up is data centers globally, right? This is a big deal, right? This is something most companies don't even implement on their own, right? Hey, I have an office in this city and another city 300 miles away or 300 kilometers away. Great. I need maybe one or two data centers, right? Not three, not four, right? Depends. So despite all the disaster recovery and business continuity or BFCP plans that's there, no single enterprise will ever exceed the geographical footprint of a typical cloud vendor, right? As AWS as an example. And we're talking about hundreds of geographic regions, each with thousands and possibly, if you add them all up, millions of servers all over the world, right? So the footprint is massive, massive. And so this is really good news for us, because it doesn't matter where we are, doesn't matter where we deploy our services today. We want to set up a branch office, we've just merged with another organization in another continent, right? Guess what? We can stick to our cloud vendor because they operate everywhere. And so this is never going to be the case. So this is a really powerful part of the story. um, the last part is, finally, lower costs become more agile and innovate faster, right? And this is really interesting, right? And I feel, the low cost is because you won't see the low cost on day one. And I'll tell you why from my experience, is because you there are a lot of things we take for granted in terms of cost in our on-premise environments, and only when we go to the cloud do these costs come up. And sometimes these are hidden costs. That means in our on-premise environment we never really understood the costing, or we never even costed them in the first place. And that's why sometimes people may say, hey, the cloud is more expensive, and it's actually the number one reason people leave the cloud. Those that eventually do, but they eventually come back around to it, is that the cost. And only when you start understanding your costs do you really understand the cloud story. And the thing around agility and innovation faster, this is something that's really, really powerful. So let's start with this, because this is a very critical, aspect of why, we're talking about this. So with AWS, so I'll double click into this a little more now. With AWS, there's really a couple of areas, right? I would say you can divide them into just four of these, right? Better security, higher resilience, right? That means if things break, they won't break, means there's always a backup that'll just jump in, right? And then there's agility. And this is something, it took me a while personally to understand this, and we'll cover that here. And then increased, lower costs. Well, I guess sort of. And going back to my earlier point. So let's jump in with security, right? So what do we mean by security, right? So to answer this question, we must first understand that, hey, as I mentioned before, AWS is super secure. Yes, we are running it on somebody else's computer, but guess what? So is everyone else. And as a result, because everybody else is running on AWS's computer, AWS has to achieve a better security posture than any enterprise IT environment would ever do on premise, right? It has many security features. In fact, security is probably the largest number of overall features, right? In fact, it outranks features specific to performance or high availability. Security is right at the top. So an example would be, some of you may even work for large enterprises today. And if you take the number of dedicated security personnel in your organization. Maybe you open up your address, your email address book, and just see how many people have the word title security in it, right? As a quick overview, right? Or your corporate intranet search on individuals. And then, maybe it's 3, 4, 5, 10, 20, right? Like it won't be over 100. And if it's over 100, maybe a few hundred, maybe a couple of hundred if you're a very large organization. But guess what? With with AWS, you can add a few zeros to whatever number you come up with, because that's the number of security folk that AWS has, and that applies to pretty much all cloud hosting providers, right? In fact, the bigger the cloud hosting provider, the larger these security teams are, right? And these security teams, there's red teams, there's blue teams, there's a mix of red and blue teams and purple teams, right? Like again, the goal here is to talk about security. Security is the number one priority for cloud vendors. In fact, they need to protect not only their environment but also their ecosystem, as well as your data and workloads that live within the cloud. So this is really, really a paramount importance. Next up is higher resilience. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think about it, a lot of organizations today, right? They have, they can easily, if you think about it, in our existing on-premise environment, we have resilience built into our workloads. Hey, if something switches off, if this machine switches off, a backup will take over, right? And there's some level of recoverability in there. Guess what? With cloud, you can supercharge all of these abilities, right? We don't have to worry about it. Even in a situation, let's say your entire data center goes dark, maybe you have one data center and the power just runs out and your auxiliary power, backup power is not coming up. Guess what? Everybody go home. There's nothing we can do, right? So that's a great example of that, right? So, and if we want to order more hardware, guess what? We're going to have to, wait, and that causes delay, and that delay is harmful to businesses, right? And this is very interesting because just before the pandemic, or just a little after the pandemic started, I think it was around March 2020, you know there was a huge demand for compute services, servers, IT equipment in general. And part of that was factories were being switched off, supply chain was being disrupted, and not enough hardware was being built. And the only option was to go to the cloud. In fact, the cloud vendors even had trouble at that time. And this was like a once in a 100-year event, right? The pandemic, this kind of event. So, you know, they they have capacity, but they didn't expect the whole planet to go cloud, literally in a matter of days. So, but now, thankfully they've already figured that out. The whole world is on cloud. And so, you know this is where we can, cloud can help us. We don't have to go through a bunch of change requests to get hardware shipped to us, work with accounting. How long is this equipment going to stay on our books? Do we have to deploy some weird accounting rules to write it off every year? Right? All of that disappears when you switch to the cloud. Why? Because now it's a pay as you go model. The more you consume, the more you pay, and you just pay for that moment. That's it. If you don't need those services, you can always turn them off or pause them and then move on, right? And so on. So this is the power of the cloud. Next up is increased agility. In my opinion, this is the number one reason for using AWS, right? So in AWS, your team does not really need to learn every single component. Rather, they just need to know how to use, right? And this is a great question. There was a question a lot of people ask is, hey, do I need to know coding? The answer is absolutely not, right? And I'll give you the analogy of driving a car versus rebuilding a car. You get into your car today, do you are you capable of rebuilding your car from scratch, like buying wheels, getting a steering wheel, and then building it? No, everything is built. You just go in, switch it on, and you have the instructions on how to use it, and that's all you need. And that's exactly how the cloud operates, right? It gives us this ability to deploy our services right away, and at the same time, it allows us to experiment. And this experiment is really helpful to businesses that want to deploy new services. Hey, I have an e-commerce brand. I want to launch a new brand for, a new customer segment, right? Can I deploy it very quickly? Answer is yes, right? Through cloud, you can. And this is really, really powerful. And last off, as I started the dialogue around lower costs, and we'll look at this, this is really where, a lot of cloud migrations start off with this thing about a business case. It's brought to the CFO, to the business planning department's office, and saying, hey, look at this. If I move to the cloud, it's going to lower costs. And I would often look at these reports and I would say, sort of. And the reason I say sort of is not because of anything, but, if we're going to the cloud, have we actually calculated the cost of moving our business at light speed that we could not do before in our on-premise environment? Like, I can deploy experiments, I can have that increased agility, I have higher resilience, things are not going offline. Am I including those in my cost? That's a very important part of the discussion, and oftentimes it's not, and so that's where I would say that the cloud overall will be lower, but a lot of times it's how you look at the math, right? And so, and I say sort of is sometimes we don't pay attention to the person, that we've hired in our data center that brings in a crash card when a server dies and is doing all that stuff. Guess what? We don't have to do any of those things anymore once we move to the cloud. And that doesn't mean we still don't need this individual. We do. What they do is they now look after the monitoring in the cloud environment, right? And make changes on the fly. So it's a much better, you know a work-life balance that happens, right, with individuals. So this is really, so everybody wins. So in the end, what it comes down to is the way we lower costs in the cloud is we actually save a bunch of time, mostly. And that's really where the lower cost discussion comes in, right? Operating in AWS is going to save us time, and we all know time is money. And so, yeah, it's lower costs, right? As an example. And we can have that conversation about headcount, right? Overnight, you're not going to just get rid of headcount. Rather, people are going to change their jobs. They're going to move to higher cognitive tasks, right? Instead of doing software updates, people are going to be more inclined to work on automation and how to mitigate problems. And hopefully, all of this will get us quicker to the 3-day weekend, right? So, that's what I'm hoping for. So, um, um, and again, if you guys want to definitely check some more out, don't forget to check out our blog post, right? Where we have some more information coming around startup guides and design and signing up for AWS. Definitely we'll have that in as well. So now that I know why I'm going AWS, how do I deploy, right? Like, one of the things about designing IT infrastructure in an on-premise environment versus cloud, I'm always asked the question, where do I start, right? And I guess it starts with the first question is, what are the pains that we go through when we're planning out our on-premise environment? The first is capacity planning, right? Guess what? We won't need to do any of that, right? And so these are just a list of design principles, right? They sort of highlight the differences of running our IT environment or IT workloads in our own data center versus a cloud hosting provider, not just AWS, but all of them, right? So as an example, number one, stop guessing our capacity needs. So, in the past, I recall an enterprise I worked for in the past where, 8 months out of the 12 months in a year was just dedicated to doing capacity planning. And it would take up a significant portion of the IT staff. And they would ask all kinds of questions like, how many servers do we really need? How are we going to save money? How are we, where are we going to be needed? Where are these servers going to be needed? Hey, what is our change window for doing the physical installation, the racking and stacking, right? Because our business is sensitive to outages. How are we handling functional testing versus load testing? And the list sort of goes on and on. So guess what? All of this disappears. You no longer have to worry. When you operate in the cloud, AWS will take care of all of this. The next up is test systems at production scale, right? And this is really awesome because guess what? In the cloud, I can simply spin up temporary resources for my testing to match my production scale. And then once I'm done with the testing, I can then scale them back down and get rid of them or pause them. I don't really need them after the testing is complete. This way, I'm only paying for resources that I consume, not rather than having them around. And that just changes the game for quality assurance, for testing, all of that stuff, compared to an on-premise environment. 3 and 4 are kind of related, right? The messaging here is, you automate and evolve, right? Why? Simply because it is hard to do if you're managing hardware on your own in your on-premise data center, right? And now I know there are automation tools that are available in on-premise data center, but guess what? The tools you'll get in the cloud are just those same tools on steroids. And as a result, it creates a new mindset for designing and deploying and sustaining IT architectures and infrastructures, right? So this is something, a much bigger conversation, and we'll definitely have future sessions around that. The next piece is around, number 5 and 6, right? Drive architectures using data, improve through game days, right? This is all about deep diving into some principles around security from AWS, right? So many years ago, I came across, of 5 bold words scribbled on a security manager's whiteboard. And it was basically describing every company's real security posture, which is keep people away from data, right? Yeah, keep people away from data. It sounds funny, but it's, I'm glad someone put it in there in very simple language, because we understand that not everybody in the organization is IT security savvy. In fact, the further you can keep individuals from data, the better it will be for your organization and individuals, right? And so those are some of the things that we started learning about within that. And then finally, um, you know, this was really, really key for us, right? Um, so let's jump into the next one, which is really around a full list of AWS building blocks, right? So as we know, AWS is an ecosystem of different building blocks. And, sometimes I get this question around this time is, hey, what's the difference between AWS versus Azure versus GCP? Right? That's a great question. It sometimes comes in. So let's give some context here. Very quick 1 minute here. AWS was first to market, and therefore it had first mover advantage. And being first, there's a benefit, that you're there all on your own. You're the first. You can build up the inertia that other companies have to overcome if they show up after you. But guess what? As a result, AWS also has the biggest ecosystem with the widest and deepest number of offerings. And sometimes this works against us, especially if we're beginners to AWS, right? And that's what this whole webinar and the series of webinars getting started with AWS is focused on, right? Is so on. So, we know Amazon, AWS has been around a long time, 2006, right? And at that time, AWS was deploying mostly infrastructure as a service, right? Like EC2, VPC offerings. Don't worry what these mean. We are going to cover some of the topics around these, elastic compute, right? Virtual private compute, right? And so on. So this is something we're going to cover. And so AWS generally does infrastructure as a service really well, right? As an example. And then obviously we had Microsoft enter, Google enter, and IBM, but still AWS is still the market leader today, and Microsoft with its Azure cloud brand closely behind. And then there's GCP, right? And then there's a huge drop, and then it's everyone else, right? And so, but they all have their own benefits. And I would say, in another way of looking at it, they all are the same. And I would say probably not exactly the same. And the analogy I'd like to use is Lego, right? I know maybe some of us have played Lego when we were a child. I know I step on my child's Lego all the time. It's just occupational hazard of being a parent. And so, imagine Legos, right? So Legos, right? There's different colorful blocks. And when you go to the Lego store, guess what? You can buy either the Lego blocks by themselves, right, in bulk, and they do it by the weight, I guess, or you can buy these boxes of built-in Lego kits, right? There's a kit for a school bus. There's a kit for a restaurant, right? That you can build. A kit for a shopping mall, right? Like a kit for a Death Star, right? So you can buy all kinds of Lego kits, and that's what the other cloud vendors like Azure and GCP are. They're basically hundreds of boxes of Lego kits that you can walk into. And what's nice about Lego kits is they come with their own set of instructions and have all the pieces you need to get the job done. And that's awesome. And so a lot of people gravitate towards Azure and GCP, but AWS is still the market leader, and it's probably because AWS is the building blocks. You can build everything and everything with that. And so AWS is equivalent to flying over to Europe, going straight to the Lego factory in Denmark and walking into the front door and seeing all the millions of different kinds of Lego pieces, and they're all in different bins, they're all sitting on the shelves. I know it's a little little intimidating, but that's what it is. Oftentimes they won't be instructions, and if there is, one awesome thing I would definitely recommend is that as you start your AWS journey, you will get better at crafting the right type of Google search, right? And that's really what the joke is between an experienced AWS practitioner and a beginner, is how well are your Google search intent, queries, right? And typically, as I mentioned in AWS, there's actually more ways to solve a problem, right? So if you want to solve something, you want to deploy something, there's typically one, two, or three, or four, five different ways of building that out, right? And what's nice is because AWS has been around for a while, what's nice is when you look at your search results, you'll see, hey, I want to search to build this with AWS technology. Maybe there's 6 technologies I need. What if I can find out how to integrate 2 of them? Chances are you'll easily find not just one article, but several articles about that. So this is the thing. Of all the 3 providers, AWS versus Azure versus GCP, which one you want to go with? I would often say it's depends. From a cost perspective, they have very similar costing models, and I'm a big fan of all 3. And I'm glad there's 3 because it helps us as customers to have greater choice and better pricing and so on. So this is really, really key. So within the building blocks, our goal here is obviously not to go through each one. We'd be here for a few weeks, but really to look at what are some of the common ones, right? So just looking at, some of the common ones here that we can think of, right? The AWS ecosystem is so large, right? Some of the most common services, I would say from a starting point, it's compute, it's storage, it's database, right? And networking. These are sort of the bread and butter of building out any IT infrastructure. Now you're going to put application integration on top of that. There's the developer tools, there's the security, identity, and compliance piece, as well as the management and governance. So these are sort of the wrappers that go around the whole infrastructure, right? And so this is the power of AWS, right? So just to refresh here, this is, AWS is, think of it as an a la carte model, right? It's everything. There's a whole buffet out here, and you pick and choose which technologies you want to bring in and integrate with each other, and so on. And so the most important part is crafting a good Google search, right? So um, these are some of the things. Now, with AWS, some of the things that come up for us is, what's the basic unit of organization in AWS, right? What's the atomic unit? If I want to get started today, what is the one thing I want? Because everything that we had, and if I go back to the slide that we had, each of these building blocks is really, there's several products associated, let's say under compute, right? And we'll look at what those are here in a short bit when we do our demo. But each of these products is basically a resource. And so the way to handle these resources or the unit of organization for these resources is called an account. And an account or an AWS account is the basic unit of organization in AWS, right? So AWS has accounts. I know Azure has subscriptions and GCP has projects. All of these are sort of roughly equivalent to each other, right? So each resource you create in AWS, whether it be, a compute instance, a storage volume, a virtual network, they can all be linked to one and only one unique AWS account, right? Yes, you can implement a bit of cross account sharing, but that's typically it. We need um, one particular account. Now, an account, as I mentioned, is not only a unit of organization, it's also a unit of billing and even access, right? And so on. So this is how we establish the billing boundary and the access boundary within AWS. Everything comes down to the account level. That's your boundary, right? And yes, there are clever ways in which we can consolidate our billing across multiple AWS accounts. Again, a very advanced feature, something to discuss in the future for us. But typically, when I build an AWS account, right, whether I'm building it for work or for business or for personal, right, and it will ask you when you create your own AWS account, right? We need a root user to be associated with it, right? And this root user essentially is just an administrative account for us to manage the account at all levels, right? So typically, a root user will need a unique email address, and then basically it's a one-to-one pairing. A single email address needs to be associated with one account, right? And so on. And obviously, when you do the sign up, we also have to provide a payment method when you sign up for AWS, right? Very, very important for us to build that payment method in. And I'll speak a little about why in a second here. Um, and so we start with, every resource, as I mentioned, right? Every resource, maybe it's a compute node or a server, or it's a storage volume, or, and so on. Every resource in AWS is going to have a globally unique identifier, right? And so what is the nomenclature or naming convention of this globally unique identifier today, right? And it's called an ARN, or an Amazon Resource Name, right? That's what ARM stands for. And it has a specific format. And as you get more familiar with AWS, you'll become more familiar with ARNs, right? And every AWS resource starts with ARN, right? And then has a colon as a separator, right? So that's something to note. There's no quiz here, but this is just something to note um, for us. Um, And finally, we have what is called a partition, right? And typically, most of the time, our partitions are going to be ARN colon AWS, unless we're working for a US government entity or we are running workloads in China, right? As an example. Um, the next part that's attached to it is the service name, right? And for most part, it'll be the short form name. We're not going to come out and say Elastic Compute Cloud. It'll be EC2, right? As an example. And then finally, it'll have the region name. And this is, again, really important. As I mentioned, that AWS has many different geographic regions. And as a result, we want to specify which region it's coming from, right? And we'll definitely talk about global infrastructure for AWS in our next blog post. We have some sessions coming up around that. So definitely check that out. And so this is some example US East 1, where it's in the US, it's in the east coast of US 1, EU, the Europe, it's in the west side of Europe, AP, Asia Pacific, right? It's in the south, possibly Australia, right? Singapore, areas like that, and so on. And so on. So this is a great example of, and so basically this ARN, this nomenclature or this naming convention tells us right away, what's our resource, what's the partition, what's the service, what's the region, and now it gives us the account ID, right? And typically this is a 12-digit account ID, right? It gets auto-generated every time, there's a new account being created. Very important we protect the account ID and not just share it with everyone, right? And then second of all is we're going to have the resource ID, right? And the resource ID will again be different based on what type of resource we're talking about. The end result of all of this is that we now have a globally unique identifier which could use to provide access control or permissions or sharing or whatsoever anywhere in that AWS ecosystem. So this is really, really powerful. In fact, I would recommend that you guys sign up for your own AWS account, and I'll do a quick demo of that, what that means today. And you just have to be careful about cost. Yeah, and I'll talk a bit about cost here when we do ours here in a second here. But I also want to go through some of the free tier, the free services or the trial services that are also available in when you create your account. So as you guys can see here, in the AWS account creation, the first is this link, portal.aws.amazon.com/billing. Yes, the word billing is right in the URL. Why? It's a reminder that we or whoever is setting this up is responsible for the charges that you incur when you are using AWS, right? Yeah, and another question that sometimes comes up is, hey, can I set up charge limits, right? Can I set up charge limits? And the answer is you cannot set charge limits in AWS. In fact, none of the other cloud vendors you can do that, but we can implement monitoring around charges so that if your charges go over a specific threshold or approaching something, a threshold, you can get a notification on that. Yeah. So just to rephrase, there is nowhere in AWS if where if the charges go over a threshold, AWS will automatically pause and suspend your account. You can't do that. And again, as I mentioned, it's the same behavior for all the cloud vendors, right? But if you want to work for free, you want to read about the free tier, yes, we're going to talk about that here. Um, the most important is the root account email, right? That you choose is very important. Now, what root account email address should we use? It all depends. So let's say you're using a personal account today, and the reason you want to do this is because you really want to learn AWS. And if you want to learn AWS, you're eventually going to need to create multiple AWS accounts, right? And so when you need those multiple accounts, each of them has its own unique alias and so on associated with it. So that's what I would recommend is create an alias and then use that alias in AWS. Don't just put your personal email address in there, but create an alias of it and use it. Call it AWS at yourname.com, right? Or AWS yourname at gmail.com or Hotmail or Drive or look, whatever it is that you're using. So if you're doing this work, if you're doing this for work, what could you do? Then I would request that you ask your work to create a distribution list, even if your work email address is the only member of that distribution list, right? It's fine. Eventually, other people are going to be brought in, right, into that distribution list because, again, you're one person. You don't want to be the single point of failure for AWS announcements and notifications and so on. So, for those of you who think, oh, it's just another notification, well, it's important. Why? Let's say if somebody broke into your server and the reason they did that was you allowed SSH access from anywhere in the entire world and somehow they broke through. Wouldn't you want to receive a notification that someone broke through, right? And that's really what it comes down to. Next up, we're going to look at is this free tier, aws.com/free. So we're going to look at some of these here in a second here. So let's go into our demo. I kind of have it ready to go.
Hey, Zaki, before you get into the demo, we have a question from Paul. Do you know if information like the Amazon resource name is covered in the AWS Solution Architect exam?
It's covered actually even before that exam. There's the cloud practitioner, and that's where it's covered actually. So it's covered in there. So it's a prerequisite, like not a hard prerequisite, but a recommended prerequisite. So you'll know all about ARN and all of this stuff even before you get to the exam, and you'll get to refresh it and play with it as well, right? During the exam, during your study guide. So definitely, it is something that is
Great,
covered.
thank you.
Excellent question. um, and definitely ask the questions right as we come in. So let me double check here. Let's share my screen. I'm sharing my second screen here. So I created an email address, just a regular Google one, and I set it up today. Basically, as I mentioned, you can go to aws.com and you can sign up here, put your root email address and sign in. You can even enable single sign-on here. I haven't enabled it, but you can have it enabled. You can even have multi-factor authentication. I think it does that by default, so I had to do multi-factor authentication by default. And then it just takes us to this sort of screen, right? This little console here. There's a new management console. I didn't want to change it because then it will change everything. So let's spend some time here on looking at, this is sort of our home screen. As you can tell, I'm based in Toronto, Canada, so I'm coming in through the eastern part of the continent, right? So East US 2, that's where my console is hosted out of. And right off the bat, because this is a brand new account, I haven't really built anything yet. It has a bunch of things here. If I want to get started really quickly, hey, do you want to launch a virtual machine? You can do that. There's these guided walkthroughs of building a virtual machine, a web app, a virtual server, registering a domain, all of these things. great stuff, which you probably want to go in and learn. There's some helpful tidbits about free AWS training here. And this is just about, mostly it's just a documentation where the current documentation is listed. And then obviously there's learning paths and things of that nature, which, can come back to Cloud Institute as well, as an example. So if I'm here, first thing I would do is I'd go under services, right? And lo and behold, my building blocks of building my Lego from scratch, my Lego kits are all located here. If I click on compute, it gives me the different products under compute, right? EC2, a very popular one, virtual servers in the cloud. There's Lambda. There's a bit of all of these. So if I can go and click on any one of these, it will just take me to the screen. I could launch it if I want and then configure it. We're not going to do that today, but just to show you it's available. We'll probably do it in the next webinar a little more. But this is just to show you guys what's available, how it's available. Um, one of the things about some of this is, it's really, if you have a situation with, let's say, hey, with my on-premise environment, when my servers went offline, I would know, is it the same? And the answer is absolutely yes. In fact, it's even better. AWS has its own dedicated health dashboard called status.aws.com. And if you click here, it will report either there's any existing issues in your environment, anything that's scheduled, any other notifications, right? If you want to look at how AWS is doing as a whole, you can look at AWS and look at all the different services running in North America, for instance, all the different regions. Guess what? Everything is running pretty well. There's a green across the board, right, for all of these different services. And so this is a very powerful tool. You can go back and check it out and look at it. Now, one of the things that come up around, when you go in for your solutions architect associate exam, or your cloud practitioner exam, it all depends where you are. You'll definitely get information about what ARN is and what it does. The next piece is really looking at the free tier, right? And oftentimes I get asked the question is, can I use the free tier to study for my exam? And the answer is yes, you can. But if you work for an organization, guess what? They may already have an educational account for you that you can use, leverage, and you don't have to worry about this whole free tier business, and so on. So, just a thought there for everyone. Um, and so from a free tier, there's some things that start when you switch it on. There's a free trial, either 30 days or so. There's even free services that are gonna, once you sign up, they'll be free for the next 12 months. And there's stuff that's always free. But if you were to really look at this, you could start by looking at product categories. Hey, I need compute. What can I get for free? Oh, look at that. From the free tier, I can get access to 750 hours of EC2. That's crazy. That's really good. There's Amazon Light Sale, which is a more simplified version of EC2, right? Like and it's meant for more non-technical folks, right? Um, and then I have Lambda, I have Elastic Cloud Registry, I have load balancing, all kinds of things that you can build and so on. So this is a great place to get started, to build out what you need. Start up with a free account and then play around with it, and just keep a tab about it. Typically when I teach AWS, I hardly incur more than $8 to $10 of expense a month just teaching the classes. I mean, it's my credit card. I don't even track it anymore. It's just, we don't even need it. Like, it's just so imperceptible in terms of the cost is. And so, okay, so getting back, that's pretty much what we had for today. Just to give you guys a quick summary of some of the things we covered. We looked at, you know, um, we looked at uh, we looked at sort of the high level journey of what is the cloud, right? We looked at what is the cloud, what is AWS. We took an initial stab at it. We looked at why AWS, right? Because of security, higher resilience, increased agility, and lower cost. We then jumped into understanding what are some of the design patterns or design principles and security principles of building AWS. We looked at even a bonus topic of what's the difference between AWS and Azure and GCP. Those are Lego kits, right? AWS is your just your blocks, and those are your Lego kits. So if you with your blocks, you can build everything, but it requires a bit of expertise. And once you get that going, then you can easily deploy that. We looked at some common services in AWS. We looked at setting up an account. We need one unique account to do it. And if you want, you can just set up an alias and then use the alias for tie it to your work email or your personal email address and so on. We looked at accounts as sort of the basic unit of organization and so on. And we looked at how that ARN naming convention works and so on. And and I think that probably covers it from a intro level to AWS, right? Quick 45, 50-minute intro to AWS. And what we'll do now, I'm sure there are a lot of burning questions, is I'll pass it off for quick Q&A and any other questions that we have in the last remaining time that we have today on that. Did you guys, let me ask the question in the chat before we get to questions. Was this useful? Was this the right type of, content from a beginner perspective? Obviously, we know some of you may already know all of this, maybe a refresh and a rehash, but this is sort of our first webinar in our series of getting started. So we thought we would have to start somewhere, right, at the beginning. So.
All right, thanks, Zaki. As a reminder, guys, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat. We do have a couple waiting for you. Paul
Awesome.
also asked regarding the billing, as you turn on services, does it tell you the cost, like per minute or per gigabyte, what you're going to be expected to pay?
So that's an excellent question, Paul. So every resource has their own unique way of metering, right? It's kind of like the electricity meter in your house, right? Like you're using it, every time you use it, you'll incur it. But what's nice is there's actually pricing tools. We will give you an estimate when you click on the tool, it'll give you an estimate of exactly how much it's going to cost. It's usually per hour. And sometimes you can get a discount on that depending on the hour, depending on whether you're going for reserved and unreserved, right? So you will get that cost estimation upfront and then recalculate, hey, I need to run this service for 4 hours. And then the service, when you deploy it, yes, there is a mention of cost up there, and you can multiply that by 4 and you'll get the cost. That's your budget, right? So that's a quick way of budgeting. Obviously, there's bigger AWS budgeting tools out there, right, that you can look at and build out, right? So I would definitely encourage you to, look at the AWS pricing calculator, um, you know, um, you know, and what I'll do here is there's also an AWS, it's calculator.aws you can click on. There's also a monthly calculator that's available. Um, what I'll do here is I'll paste it into the chat here. Give me a second here. Let me just see if I can. So I'm pasting it in the chat here. So hopefully that answers the question. Um, there's a question here from Waz. Your perspective and observation of cybersecurity across perceived gaps. Yes, cybersecurity, almost everybody, all of my friends are going into cybersecurity. It's the place that, has the most growth from a supply chain. Yeah, there's definitely lots of things within AWS around cybersecurity we can help. There's definitely a whole gamut of different courses, right? So the question could be, hey, what kind of certification that you could look at, right? So there's, within AWS, there's obviously foundational level certifications, there's associate level, professional level, specialty level, right? And in the specialty level, there's the AWS certified security specialty, right? And that's probably where you can look at things like identity and access management, IAM, virtual private cloud, VPC, key management system, KMS, CloudTrail, web application firewall, WAFs, and other things as well. That's also covered in there. So hopefully that gives you the thing. And then, Paul, I've answered your question. And then I think that's it. Paul, is another question. Are there certain workloads that lend itself more to AWS versus Azure? And again, this is a great question because, as I mentioned, Azure and GCP are more like kits, Lego kits. So, if you want to build something, you may be able to build it quicker in Azure and so on, right? just because there are more detailed instructions and things of that nature. Not saying there aren't instructions for AWS, it's just sometimes difficult to find, and there could be many different moving pieces, right? Whereas with Azure and GCP, there's a certain level of abstraction of complexity that's done. So it's a lot more simplified. I mean, it is still complex, don't get me wrong, but and so on. But with AWS, again, there's many different ways to build something. So it all depends, right, on what you want to build and how you want to build it. So I would say it's a bit of both. I typically don't have anything. In another organization I work for, they've traditionally been an Azure shop, but they run their dev environment in AWS, but they run sort of their business analytics and BI, all of that still within the Azure world, right? And that's where they've always were. And yes, you can have both multi-cloud environments running, and that's going to be a very good topic around multi-cloud, how to use all the different tools, example Terraform and so on down the road. If you guys are interested, those will be future topics for us.
Okay, great. I don't see any other questions in the chat. So we'll end it here. Thank you everyone for joining. We really appreciate you being here. You will get the replay delivered in your email shortly after this ends. If you have any feedback or questions, please reach out directly to me. My email address, jana.finch@cloudinstitute.io. It's also in all of the reminder emails you received for this webinar. And thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, guys, and hopefully everyone has a great day. And keep on learning, keep on swimming, and we'll catch you on the next one. Take care, everyone.